Alan Rusbridger, journalist and former editor-in-chief of The Guardian from 1995 to 2015, and you are the author of the new book, News and How to Use It. Welcome to Tell a Friend.
Very pleased to be here.
So let's begin with the subtitle of the book, which is What to Believe in a Fake News World. So tell me, how did we get in this predicament?
Well, the broad story is familiar, that for 250 years, the people who owned the printing presses and the broadcasting studios had a complete monopoly of what people read and listened to. They had very little choice. And in the space of 15 years, 4 billion people can now publish, and there's a tidal wave of stuff. Some of it's very good, some of it's rubbish, some of it's dangerous, and people are losing a sense of what to believe and what not to believe any longer. Journalists, of course, would like people to believe them. You know, they say, look, we're the professionals, come back to us. But sadly, most of the surveys of trust say that actually the public find that difficult. So that was the sort of origins of the book, really.
Now, during your tenure at The Guardian, you were responsible for breaking many of the biggest stories that we've seen, not least the phone hacking scandal, which you worked on with Nick Davies. So I wanted to know from you, what impact do you think the phone hacking scandal had on public trust in the media?
Obviously not good. I think the public will often be quite skeptical about the methods that journalists use. But here was evidence of widespread criminal behavior in a newspaper group. We've since learned that it was more widespread in other newspaper groups as well. And I think it caused deep unease that journalists really on a sort of industrial scale were intruding into people's privacy. And of course, it still goes on to this day in the sense that the newspapers are still paying out millions and millions and millions of pounds in court cases to try and settle these cases.
Now, since the Leveson inquiry, and obviously since the scandal broke, have you seen any real cultural change in the way that Fleet Street operates?
Yes, I think there has been. I would be amazed. We wouldn't necessarily see it, but I would be amazed if journalists were behaving in the same criminal way, if they were using private detectives and inquiry agents quite so much or at all. And I think there has been a sea change in views on privacy. I mean, there was a time, and the News of the World, of course, which closed over the phone hacking scandal, was the prime exponent of this. They used to try and wreck lives every single week by putting somebody on the front page who had done something wrong, usually in their private life. And I think that's changed now. And so Fleet Street feels a different place, and I would say a better place.
Now, during your 20 years at The Guardian, could you give us a sense of what your overriding principle was in conducting your work?
Well, I think, I mean, as a broad statement of what The Guardian was about, it was about trying to write about things that were both true and important. It tried to be internationalist, to try and take a very wide view of the world and the influences on people's lives. It is a small L liberal newspaper, always has been since 1821. And when you become editor of The Guardian, they just say, can you continue as heretofore? That's all you're told. So you think about the instincts and traditions of the paper. And of course, during my time as editor, I also had the additional challenge of trying to move from print to digital, which was a huge and not easy revolution, which continues to this day.
And whilst you were in that role, did you acknowledge the level of power you had? I mean, The Guardian is, one of the most read newspapers, read daily across the world. Were you aware of that gatekeeping power you had? And if so, how did you go about managing it?
Yeah, it's a very strange thing when you become an editor. One day you're reasonably anonymous, nobody would recognize you at the pub or the street, and then the next day you are the sort of figurehead of a very important institution, and people hold you responsible for everything the paper does, quite rightly. And I was conscious of the power. I'm quite uneasy about it because I think no one elects newspaper editors, and yet they certainly try to influence events. And I was particularly conscious that journalism is a very imprecise craft, art, profession, whatever you want to call it, and that we make mistakes. And it ought to be part of journalism to be very responsive to criticism and correction and clarification. So actually, one of the first things I did was to appoint an independent reader's editor who would be responsible for correcting mistakes. So if anybody felt that we had got something wrong, they wouldn't come to the editor, the person who had made the mistake in the first place. They could go behind the editor to somebody who would then independently judge. And that was, if you like, trying to give away a bit of power, because I think the power of editors can be troubling.
And when you look at the rise of independent media, for example, this platform we're on right now, podcasting, social media, blog writing, do you see the role of the traditional gatekeeper as being diminished? So do you think that role has almost been democratized?
These alternative forms of media, including the one we're speaking on, it can be excellent and sometimes better than mainstream media. On Twitter, I find lawyers and doctors and governmental specialists who are really expert and completely trustworthy. And so journalism has got to raise its game to remain trusted and relevant. At the same time, there's an awful lot of rubbish out there on social media. But again, journalism has to think, well, how can we persuade people that we are the ones who should be trusted? And I think sometimes journalists don't think about that hard enough. They sort of expect that people will trust them because they work for such and such a paper or such and such a brand, or because they are who they are, or just because they say, I'm a professional journalist, you ought to trust me. But I think in the 21st century, trust is earned in different kinds of ways, some of which journalists haven't yet necessarily caught up on.
Now, in your book, you lay out, it's laid out in an alphabetical format where you give people a sense of the process of making news. You almost remove that barrier behind the reader and those in charge of producing news. And here you talk about horizontal leadership, and you also talk about Grenfell in one of the sections and about the lack of media diversity. And I wanted to know from you, how do editors and journalists as a whole bridge that gap between the readers who are actually consuming their work and the people who are writing it? How do you bridge that gap and engage people in the process of news production?
Yeah, well, I think there's a realization now in media that the audience they're addressing has obviously changed a great deal in the last 40, 50 years, and that it's commercial good business to want to engage those readers, but it's also editorially good. So if your newsroom is full of people who are all from a similar background, then you're probably only going to be able to reflect faithfully a fairly narrow segment of your readership. So there's lots of reasons to try and broaden the diversity of people in newsrooms, both commercial and editorial. And it's something that I think media organizations have really struggled to do, but are waking up to. I mentioned Grenfell because there was that sort of very poignant footage when the day after the terrible fire, when journalists, nearly all of them white, probably most of them middle class, turned up at Grenfell And there was an audience there was a group of shocked people who lived in the tower or nearby, who just didn't look at all like the people who were coming to report on them, and they were really angry. You may have seen that confrontation with Jon Snow. He was a really nice, decent man. People shouting at him, where were you? Why did it take this to make you come down here? And so, it's time to think about these things. And to be fair to my colleagues in the media, I think they are.
Now, when if we turn our attention to the way that we actually respond to fake news, in the book you talk a lot at depth about the importance of fact checking, and you talk about how in newsrooms, employed fact checkers, we're actually seeing them being, taken away from this cycle of news production. But I wanted to ask you, do you really think that fact checking is the be all and end all answer? Because at times when newspapers are trying to respond to fake news, when they're trying to kind of demystify some of these false claims that are being put out there by politicians, by ordinary people, they fall into the trap of actually disseminating it further by trying to combat it. So how do journalists combat fake news, but in a way that doesn't, help it spread?
Well, it's entirely reasonable to ask that question of journalists, but I think it's a question for us all, really. I mean, this is now happening at such scale, and from the highest levels of society. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, on a daily basis would say 10, 20, 30 things that were untrue. And the problem is the scale of it. There are millions of untrue things being published every day. And yes, journalism has to be part of the answer in terms of exposing and highlighting, with the danger that you highlight, that in drawing attention to it, you maybe help spread it, even if you're debunking it. But it's a very negative view of journalism just to be sitting there as sort of shit shovelers after the parade, coming along and trying to clear up the mess that other people have created. Because if that's all you did, you wouldn't be able to get on the front foot and do important reporting of your own. So it's certainly it's part of what journalism has to do now, regrettably. But it's also important that journalists get out there and do original reporting. And we as readers have to be more skeptical about what we're reading and play our part. We should never be retweeting stuff that we haven't checked to be true. Otherwise, we're part of the problem.
Yeah, and if I pick up on that point, we do see this tendency for people to, when in doubt, blame the media. But, if we turn our attention to the responsibility of the reader, how do everyday people contribute in combating fake news? What can everyday people do who don't have necessarily the platform that you or other journalists have? What can they do?
Well, I think we're all learning to be media, aren't we? We're not all journalists, but nevertheless we are. Everybody who goes to work or goes to a school or works in a hospital or works in a shop, all those organizations are now media. And if you've got a Twitter account or a Facebook feed, or you're on Reddit or Instagram, then you're a form of media. And so we all have to think of our responsibilities about what we publish, the tone of voice in which we publish, how we respond to criticism, or how we respond when we're told that we're wrong about things, and whether we're going to be part of the problem, as I said, by spreading things that we haven't bothered to check, or we don't know if they're true or aren't true. Because if you've got 4 billion people publishing, it's going to take millions and millions of people acting as good citizens on the internet to combat that.
And if we look at the media landscape, like you just said, in the sense that everyone kind of has that power to influence using, social media, whatever media they have at use. Do you think then the way that we're going about combating fake news and fighting its spread is, not a very creative way? Because often we look at it in a very top-down process. We look at politicians, we look at the way legislation can be changed, we look at the way that newspaper editors can play their role. Do you think we need to be more creative in actually looking at how do you combat this from the grassroots up?
Yes, I mean we're at a sort of juncture point where a lot of traditional media are now failing. The economic model for news isn't there in the way that it was 20, 30 years ago. And yet we can also see what happens in a society when people don't know what to believe. If we're seeing it with COVID at the moment, the argument over the science and over vaccines, and it's pretty crucial that an awful lot of people are vaccinated for the general health of the nation and to get everybody back to work. And yet there are people out there who are lying and spreading myths about vaccines. So these things become life and death matters in the end. And we've all got to get smarter about how we inform ourselves. And the fact that you do need, I think, arbiters of what's true and what's not true, what's fake and what's real, even if there's not a commercial model for it. And that's in a way plan A. Every journalist I know hopes that we could go back to the world that we left behind with lots of advertising and lots of readers who are going to pay. But it may not work out like that. It may be that model has gone, and yet at the same time, journalism is needed as a public service, like the police or like an ambulance service or a prison service, something for which there's no traditional market, and yet there's a need.
Now, how would you say editors go about balancing this responsibility? Because they have a responsibility, obviously, to make sure that newspapers are still, a functioning business. It's still gaining income and they can support their journalists. But how do they balance that financial responsibility with that moral and ethical responsibility that they have to report the news accurately?
Well, I think the main job of an editor is to make sure that the editorial content is accurate and fair and reasonable, and that they're looking at the editorial content. There's usually a commercial team whose job is to try and then make money out of it. But of course, in the real world, editors increasingly get drawn into thinking about that too. There are editors who are, brilliant commercially, and I know some editors who also become sort of managing directors as well. So they're running everything. The danger is you get into that sort of separation of church and state business, where really it's very hard to think very commercially and very editorially. If you're to persuade readers that you are independent of all forms of power, including the power of advertisers, then it's difficult to persuade people of that, I think, if you're also responsible for the advertising. I guess what I'm saying is that editors today, I think, have to be commercially aware, and they're all trying to find new sources of revenue, new business models. But if they get too drawn into that, it could be at the peril of the editorial product.
Now, we've just had the American election, which Donald Trump lost, and it led me to kind of think a newspaper is going to have an existential crisis, because Donald Trump, whilst being, one of the biggest sources of fake news, is also one of the biggest sources of income for a lot of the media, because, they've just spent, 4 years pumping out all of this coverage on him, his campaign, and a lot of the misinformation he's been spreading. So do you think newspaper gatekeepers are really going to struggle for how do we get people interested again?
Well, I think there's a lot in that. I think it was the Washington Post yesterday they had a range of charts of coverage of Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, Donald Trump versus anybody. And he has been a source of obsession and compulsion for the last 4 years, and ratings. The New York Times has arguably never done better, I think partly because Donald Trump kept attacking it. And the more Donald Trump said this is a fake news operation, the more people rushed to support it. So I think that it will be different. I mean, personally, I feel America will be a healthier place without Donald Trump. But in a way, you have to be honest and say, well, actually, he was good for ratings and circulation, not for much else.
Now, in Nick Davies' book, Flat Earth News, he talks about this broken newsroom cycle. So he talks about the increasing pressures that are being made on journalists, the financial cuts that are being made, which ring very true for where we are at now with the coronavirus pandemic and the media cuts we've been seeing. Do you think that this financial pressure and this slimming down of the newsroom is also playing a role in preventing journalists from actually doing, thorough investigations and thoroughly fact-checking the information that they're putting out there?
Well, everything's all happening at once. So when Nick and I started in journalism, you had a really relatively leisurely day. You filed your copy by somewhere between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. and then went off to the pub. And that was the sort of the one deadline in the day, broadly. And now, of course, anybody working in a newsroom is having to do 4, 5, 6 stories or updates or takes or different media. And so the productivity has shot up, the speed has shot up, the multitasking has shot up. And the danger, I mean, not all of that is bad, but the danger is you get into what Nick described as churnalism, where you're just churning it out. The press release is here, you've got an hour to write the story, you don't have any time to make calls or independently verify it, you're just churning your way through and regurgitating stuff without really being able to verify it. Now that's I mean, it's godforsaken work to have to do, but also it's very damaging, I think, for the reputation of journalism. If journalism is about verification and context and having time to think about it and make some calls or meet people, and that's what people believe journalism is, but in fact it's not, because the economics aren't there, and at the same time they're all being asked to do this. Newsrooms are getting smaller because the revenues are shrinking. I mean, you can see why the danger is that that journalism makes itself redundant, because it's no longer creating something of value and worth. That's the gloomy story that is happening in some places, we have to be honest.
And finally, I wanted to just get, a piece of advice to you for all of the listeners who, may be skeptical about everything that they're seeing in the media, may, have a lack of trust both in politics and of journalists. What advice would you give them?
Well, be skeptical. I think skeptical is good, and where newspapers and reporters are right to be skeptical, and that's what you want them to be. Don't be cynical. Cynical is something which is much more toxic and sort of defies belief in anything. But I think as active readers, we can be much more skeptical about sources, and then in the end, you have to make your decisions about who you trust. And realize why it's important that we have an informed population. During Brexit, the citizens themselves were asked to vote on an issue, and it was vital that people were really informed about all sides of that argument. Whether they were or not is a different issue, but there's a direct relationship between trustworthy news and a good society. And places that don't have trustworthy news, in the end, either turn into dictatorships or chaos happens. So I think the point of writing this book was to try and get both journalists and audiences to think about this problem of trust, and of which skepticism is a very important part of the story.
Now, at the end of all my interviews, I have a quick fire round just to get to know you a little bit better. So I invite you to complete the sentence. The first one, the biggest misconception about me is?
The biggest misconception about me was that I was the Guardian. It's, by which I mean people thought they knew me because they read the paper, or that I agreed with everything in my own paper. And sometimes I felt, well, actually, I'm an independent person. I agree with some of it. I don't have to agree with it to publish it. And I'm probably quite a different person from the sort of person that you think when you read The Guardian. Sorry, that wasn't very quick fire, was it?
My biggest fear is?
Probably rats.
My biggest regret is?
Not working harder at music when I'm a mad keen musician. I play a lot of music, and I wish I'd practiced harder when I was younger.
I'm most proud of?
Most proud of editing The Guardian and taking it on that journey from print to digital while keeping its integrity and its seriousness, and putting it on a sort of path to the future.
And finally, the hardest lesson to learn was?
I think to keep it. I mean, it's the easiest thing in journalism. It's such a compulsive thing. I've seen a lot of journalists who just sort of do it 18 hours a day and they lose all sense of anything else, and it becomes an obsession. And I think the hardest thing to learn was to try and find something else in life and do it. Family is important. For me, music was important, but all that made me when I got into balance, and I didn't always get into balance. The things that you did that people might think of as non-essential actually made me better in my working life, because I somehow felt calmer or more prepared for the day.
Alan Rusbridger, thank you very much for joining me on Telegram.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to remind everyone to go and get your book, News and How to Use It, which is a great read. So I thank you for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryan.